Welcome to Lost at 3 a.m. Put your phone down, close your eyes, and let this be the last thing you hear tonight. No bright screens, just a quiet story, soft enough to fall asleep to. Tonight, we're beginning in the late 1970s, not in a Hollywood studio, but in a research lab, a division buried inside the digital side of Lucasfilm, a team of engineers, scientists, and a few artists, working on something no one fully understood yet. They weren't building stories, they were building tools, graphics, renderers, digital cameras, things most filmmakers weren't ready for. The team was led by a man named Ed Catmull, an idealist with a background in computer science, and a dream of one day making a full-length animated film entirely with computers. At the time, that idea sounded impossible. Computer animation wasn't taken seriously. It was expensive, it was slow, and no one was really asking for it. Still, the team kept building. They made demos, simple animations of a bouncing ball, a shiny hand, or a face made of polygons. Each one was more of a technical experiment than a piece of entertainment. But quietly, those experiments began to turn heads. One of the early recruits was a young animator named John Lasseter. He had just been let go from Disney, and he came to the team not as an engineer, but as someone who believed that story and technology didn't have to live in separate rooms. At Lucasfilm, Lasseter saw something no one else had quite seen yet. These weren't just graphics, they were characters, waiting to come to life. But money was tight, the research group was expensive, and George Lucas, dealing with the financial pressures of a post-Star Wars world, decided to let the team go. Pixar, though it didn't have the name yet, was about to disappear. Then, quietly, Steve Jobs stepped in. He had just left Apple, he had time, and he saw potential, not necessarily in the films, but in the technology. He bought the division, funded it with his own money, and helped give it a new name, Pixar. At first, it wasn't a studio. It sold computers, high-end graphics machines that barely sold, but kept the lights on. Jobs poured in money year after year, millions of dollars without profit. But behind the scenes, the team kept animating, kept telling tiny stories with digital characters. Short films like Luxo Jr. and Red's Dream started to gain attention, not just for how they looked, but for how they felt. Simple narratives, quiet emotion, something real peeking out from the pixels. And slowly, the idea that once felt impossible started to feel inevitable. The world didn't change all at once, but it had begun. Because Pixar wasn't built on a hit movie. It wasn't launched with $1 billion budget. It was born from years of quiet failure, patient invention, and a small group of people who believed that someday computers would tell stories that made people feel something. And before they ever made Toy Story, they were just trying not to get shut down. Before Pixar made Toy Story, before Buzz or Woody or Wall-E or Lightning McQueen, there was a lamp. Not a metaphor, a literal desk lamp. Small, round, metal, the kind you'd find in an office or a classroom, sitting quietly in the corner of a desk. It wasn't flashy, it didn't speak, it didn't even have a face. Just a head that could tilt and a springy base that bounced when it moved. In 1986, that lamp came to life. The short film was called Luxo Jr., and it was less than 2 minutes long. There was no dialogue, no background music, just two lamps, one big, one small, and a ball. But something about it felt alive. The big lamp watched patiently. The small lamp bounced with energy. When the ball rolled in, the little lamp chased it like a puppy, and when it popped, there was a moment of real, genuine sadness. And then, joy, because the little lamp found another ball. That was it, a tiny story, almost nothing, but the audience in the room at an animation conference in Anaheim went silent, and then they applauded, because they hadn't just watched a tech demo, they'd seen characters, emotion, movement that felt intentional, believable. It was a breakthrough moment, not because it was perfect, but because it showed what was possible, that computers could animate more than just metal and plastic. They could animate feeling. Luxo Jr. was directed by John Lasseter, who had found the original lamp sitting on his own desk. He studied the way it moved, how its head tilted, how the weight shifted when it leaned forward. He gave it personality not by adding anything, but by observing what was already there. He treated the lamp like a performer, and suddenly, the impossible idea of computers telling real stories didn't seem quite so far away. What's funny is that the team didn't expect Luxo Jr. to become iconic, but it did. Pixar adopted the lamp as its symbol, and in every film that followed, it was there, in the logo, bouncing in to crush the letter I. What started as a simple short film became a reminder of where they came from, a symbol not of power or profit, but of playfulness, curiosity, the idea that even the most ordinary object could become something magical if you just cared enough to give it a story. So before the toys, before the fish, before the emotions and the monsters and the cars, there was just a lamp and a ball and 2 minutes that changed animation forever. By the early 1990s, Pixar had made a name for itself in the animation world, not as a studio, but as the little company that made beautiful short films, quiet experiments with light, timing, and emotion. They had a few awards, a growing reputation, and a team that still wasn't entirely sure what would come next. And then came the pitch, a full-length movie, entirely animated on computers, no hand-drawn cells, no physical models, just software, shaders, polygons, and a lot of caffeine. That film would become Toy Story. It sounds inevitable now, but back then, it was a gamble so risky that even Pixar didn't know if it would work. There was no playbook, no fallback. They weren't just making a film, they were inventing the process from scratch, and every part of it was hard. First, the story. At the time, Disney was their partner and distributor, but also their critic. They pushed Pixar to make the characters edgier, more sarcastic, more adult. In early drafts, Woody was mean, cold, unlikable. The story lost its heart. And when Pixar showed the first cut to Disney executives, it didn't go well. Production shut down. The project was paused. Pixar had to regroup, rewrite, and convince everyone, Disney included, that this could still be a film worth finishing. So they started over. They brought back the warmth, the sincerity. They leaned into the idea that the characters didn't have to be cool. They just had to feel real. Woody became loyal, flawed, and quietly afraid of being replaced. Buzz Lightyear became the well-meaning newcomer who didn't know he was a toy. And suddenly, what looked like a movie about plastic figurines became something else entirely. A story about identity, about friendship, about the fear of being left behind. And behind the scenes, the animation team worked through nights, weekends, and endless lines of code. They were solving problems no one had solved before. How to make fabric fold, how to simulate blinking, how to make plastic catch the light just right. They couldn't hide behind detail either. Computers back then couldn't handle textures the way they can now. So the toys were shiny, hard, simple, and perfect. The plastic didn't have to be cheated. It was the one thing computers could do well. When Toy Story finally released in 1995, it wasn't just a hit. It was the beginning of a new era. The first feature-length film entirely created with 3D animation. No shortcuts, no hand-drawn tricks, just digital art, heart, and the kind of story that didn't talk down to its audience, whether they were 5 years old or 50. But beneath all that was a quiet truth. Toy Story only worked because the people making it refused to let the technology speak louder than the characters. They knew it had to be funny, clever, and new, but also warm, also real, and because of that, they didn't just change animation. They reminded everyone that even something made entirely on a machine could still feel human. Pixar films are full of emotion, big themes, and unforgettable characters, but tucked just beneath the surface, slipped into corners, scrawled on license plates, resting in the background of crowded scenes, there are secrets, Easter eggs, clues, a quiet kind of storytelling that doesn't need attention, but but still rewards the ones who look closely. It started small, just a few callbacks, subtle nods, but over the years, these tiny moments became a language of their own, connecting films, honoring artists, and building a world that feels more alive each time you return to it. One of the most famous is a code, a 113. It doesn't mean anything to most people, just a combination of letters and numbers. But to Pixar's artists, it's a memory. A 113 was the name of a classroom at CalArts, California Institute of the Arts, where many of Pixar's early animators studied. It was where they learned their craft, practiced timing, struggled through critiques. You'll find A113 in almost every Pixar film, on license plates, on doors, on courtroom labels or camera models. A quiet signature from the people who started out in that one little room. Then there's the Pizza Planet truck. What began as a delivery van in Toy Story has since become a Pixar tradition. It shows up everywhere. In A Bug's Life, it's parked beneath a trailer. In Finding Nemo, it drives past the dentist's office. In WALL-E, it's rusted and abandoned, floating through the wreckage of Earth's past. Sometimes you see it, sometimes you miss it, but it's always there, like an old friend passing by in the background. Another subtle constant is John Ratzenberger, the voice actor sometimes called Pixar's lucky charm. He was Ham in Toy Story, the abominable snowman in Monsters, Inc., Mac the truck in Cars. Every movie for years had a character voiced by him. Even if it was just a single line, his voice became a thread, not always front and center, but always familiar. And then there's the Luxo ball, yellow, with a blue stripe and a single red star. First seen in Luxo Jr., Pixar's early short, and since then, it's bounced its way into nearly every film. In Up, it's in a child's room. In Monsters, Inc., it sits among Boo's toys. It never draws attention to itself. It's just there. A small, silent reminder of where it all started. But maybe the most fascinating detail isn't in the objects, it's in the connections. Characters from one film quietly appear in the next, sometimes even before their own movie is released. In Monsters, Inc., a child hands Sully a plush toy of Nemo 2 years before Finding Nemo would come out. In Brave, a wooden carving of Sully sits quietly in the background of a witch's hut. And in Coco, you can spot the outlines of Incredibles characters painted on the walls during a parade. These aren't mistakes, they're signals, little handshakes between the storytellers and the audience, as if Pixar is saying, you're not just watching this movie, you're part of something larger. These moments don't change the story. They don't need to. They're not about plot, they're about presence, about memory, about leaving just enough behind for someone to notice, if they're paying attention. And in a world that moves quickly, there's something comforting about that kind of quiet detail. The kind that doesn't ask for recognition. It just waits, patiently, for someone, maybe late at night, maybe half asleep, to finally see it. Not long after Pixar had built its first few classics, Toy Story, Monsters, Inc., Finding Nemo, The Incredibles, fans started noticing something. Little connections, shared symbols, familiar shapes tucked into new places. And the deeper they looked, the more the dots started to align, not just across movies, but across time. And so a theory was born. It was simple at first, just a question. What if all the Pixar films took place in the same universe? One long, interconnected timeline, stretching across centuries. A quiet history playing out beneath the surface. Not obvious, not confirmed, but maybe, just maybe, intentional. The theory, as it's been shaped over the years, begins with Brave, a story set far in the past, where a mysterious witch seems to vanish through wooden doors. Doors that look uncannily like the portals in Monsters, Inc. Some believe this witch isn't just a craftsman, but someone who's figured out how to travel between time and place. And from there, it spirals. The Incredibles takes place in a retro-futuristic version of the 1960s, where superpowered humans begin to emerge. Possibly the first hint of a world where evolution is accelerating. Toy Story and Finding Nemo live in the everyday present. but both feature animals and objects who seem increasingly aware. Toys with consciousness, fish with memory, a subtle undercurrent that things we once thought were lifeless are beginning to think for themselves. In Ratatouille, a rat not only cooks, but understands identity, purpose, artistry. WALL-E, far in the future, shows a planet left behind by humans and managed by machines that feel more human than the people who made them. Cars, perhaps further down the line, presents a world where humanity is gone, and vehicles now drive through the skeleton of our civilization, repeating old habits they don't fully understand. And finally, Monsters, Inc., set in what might be the far future or the distant past, depending on how you look at it. A place where doorways connect time, where monsters scare children not out of cruelty, but as a way to power their cities, harvesting energy from the laughter and fear of a forgotten species. It's not confirmed. Pixar has never officially endorsed it, and most of the creators will tell you it's coincidence, a fun theory, not a plan. But that's the beauty of it. The Pixar theory isn't about being right. It's about noticing, about loving something so much you start to believe it might go even deeper. It's about the joy of imagining a story that spans centuries, where toys and fish and monsters and memories all belong to the same hidden timeline. Whether it's true or not doesn't really matter, because what it does, quietly, softly, is remind us that even the smallest details can carry meaning, that maybe the world is more connected than it seems, and that every story, even the simple ones, might be part of something bigger. You just have to squint, or stay up late enough to wonder. Before the lights go down in a Pixar film, before the studio logo fades and the music begins, there's usually something else, a moment, a breath, a small story that plays out in just a few minutes. No franchise, no sequels, just an idea told simply and with heart. These are the Pixar shorts. For a lot of people, the short films are just a bonus, an extra before the real movie starts. But inside the studio, there's something else entirely. They're a tradition, a place to experiment, to take creative risks, to try new technology, new voices, new tones, and often they're where the most human stories are told. Take Bao, for example, a story about a mother who makes a dumpling that suddenly comes to life. It's tender, strange, and deeply personal. In just 7 minutes, it explores parenthood, loneliness, overprotection, and the aching beauty of letting go. No long speeches, no epic score, just quiet metaphor, and a dumpling that breaks your heart. Or Piper, a wordless short about a baby sandpiper learning how to find food along the shoreline. There's no villain, no twist, just the rhythm of waves, the fear of failure, and the courage to try again. It's small, precise, and somehow it says more in 3 minutes than most films say in 2 hours. Then there's La Luna, a story about 3 generations of stargazers, grandfather, father and son, who sweep fallen stars from the surface of the moon. It's surreal, gentle, and quietly speaks about identity, about finding your own way, even when the people around you have already decided who you're supposed to be. And those are just a few. Some are silly, some are heartbreaking, some are there simply to play, to remind us that storytelling doesn't always need an arc or a lesson. Sometimes it just needs a mood, a flicker, a feeling. For Pixar's animators, shorts are a kind of sketchbook, a place to practice, to experiment, to see if a new rendering technique can work, or if an idea is strong enough to stand on its own. But they also serve another purpose. They show us what Pixar values most: emotion, curiosity, imagination. No matter how much technology evolves or how big the movies get, the heart of Pixar has always been about making people feel something. And the shorts, they do that without needing to say much at all. They remind us that stories don't have to be long to be lasting. Sometimes, a character with no dialogue in a world we don't understand for just a few minutes is all it takes. And long after the main feature ends, it's often those quiet little stories that stay with us. There's a moment in almost every Pixar film where the room goes quiet. Not because something explodes, or because there's a twist, but because something true has been said, without fanfare. A quiet line, a small gesture, a memory, and suddenly the tears come. It's not an accident. Pixar has become known for this, the emotional moment, but it isn't just about making people cry. It's about reaching something deeper, the kind of feeling you didn't expect to have while watching a talking car, or a fish looking for his son, or a lonely robot stacking trash on an abandoned planet. Pixar stories often start in familiar places: childhood fears, parental pressure, loneliness, change. Things we all know, even if we don't always talk about them. And then, gently, they push just a little further into places we've been too tired or too busy to sit with. Like the first 10 minutes of Up, no words, just music and time passing. A life built together, then slowly, painfully, undone. Carl and Ellie's story plays like a memory, ordinary and utterly devastating. The kind of love story that doesn't need dialogue because it feels like something we've all carried. Or Inside Out, where we're shown that sadness isn't a problem to be solved, but a feeling to be honored. That it's okay to grieve. That sometimes crying with someone does more than cheering them up ever could. Then there's Coco, where a boy sings a lullaby to his fading great-grandmother, not because it's part of the plot, but because it's the only way he can keep her memory alive. These moments don't scream. They don't ask for your attention. They simply arrive, quietly, and sit beside you. Behind the scenes, Pixar's writers and directors talk often about the emotional spine of a story. It's not the plot. It's not the twist. It's the truth, underneath all of it. What the film is really about. In Finding Nemo, it's not about a fish looking for his son. It's about learning to let your child grow up. In Toy Story 3, it's not about escaping daycare. It's about what happens when the child you've lived for no longer needs you. In Soul, it's not about chasing purpose. It's about learning to appreciate what's already here. Pixar doesn't manipulate emotion, it earns it. By grounding the biggest ideas in the smallest, most human truths. And maybe that's why it all works so well. Because somewhere beneath the animation, beneath the fantasy and the color and the talking toys, Pixar is telling stories about us. Our fears, our hopes, our goodbyes, our trying, failing, forgiving, and somehow, in a world of infinite possibilities, they keep finding new ways to show that the most powerful thing a story can do is remind you how it feels to be human. Not every Pixar idea becomes a movie. Some start as sketches or conversations over coffee. Others get as far as full storyboards, voice casting, even years of development. But then something shifts, and the story that once felt certain begins to unravel. At Pixar, this isn't failure, it's process. The studio is known for tearing its own stories apart and starting over, sometimes multiple times. They call it the ugly baby phase. Every film begins with an idea that isn't quite working, and instead of forcing it, they listen. They let it fall apart, so something better can rise in its place. But some stories never quite find their way through. One of the most famous cancelled projects was Newt. It was announced in 2008, a story about the last male and female blue-footed newts on Earth, forced together by a conservation program. They don't like each other at first, but like all good odd couple stories, things begin to change. It got far into development. There were character designs, posters, even a release year. But behind the scenes, something wasn't working. The story wasn't landing, and eventually, the project was shelved. A few years later, Rio was released by another studio, a film with a similar setup, and Pixar quietly let Newt go. Then there was The Yellow Car, a project that predated Cars entirely. It focused on a small, forgotten car in a big city, and the early drawings looked very different from the polished world that Cars eventually became. This version never made it out of development, but elements of its soul lived on. Even Up, Ratatouille, and Inside Out were nearly unrecognizable in their early drafts. Up originally involved a floating city in the sky, powered by alien technology. The house and balloons came much later. Ratatouille started with a very different storyline, focused more on Gusteau as a ghost who haunted the kitchen, and Inside Out once had over 20 emotions in the control room, until they realized the story worked better with just a few. These abandoned ideas aren't mistakes. They're part of what makes Pixar, Pixar. The willingness to throw away years of work in order to find the right story. The understanding that animation isn't just about movement, it's about meaning, and meaning takes time. Even now, there are ideas sitting in folders, characters who were halfway built, worlds that almost existed. And while we may never see them on screen, those stories still matter. Because sometimes, the best ideas don't arrive first. They arrive after everything else has fallen apart. And in the quiet space between what was planned and what was discovered, the real magic begins. Making a film at Pixar isn't a straight line. It's more like a slow, looping trail through a forest that hasn't been mapped yet. You take a few steps, double back, try again. Sometimes you're walking in circles. Sometimes you get lost on purpose, just to see what you might find. From the outside, Pixar's films feel effortless, polished, precise, but behind every finished movie is a version that didn't work, and another after that. Pixar rewrites everything. They start with a concept, maybe a single image, or a character, or a sentence that seems to have weight. But what follows is rarely smooth. The story breaks, a plot thread fails, a character feels flat, and when that happens, they do something unusual. They show it anyway. They bring it to a small group of directors, writers, and artists inside the studio. People who know how hard it is to tell a good story, because they've done it, and failed at it too. This group is called the Brain Trust. It's not a committee, there's no hierarchy, just a room full of people who are brutally honest and deeply kind. When a director shows their work, it's often a rough cut, sketches, placeholder voices, scenes that barely hang together. And the Brain Trust doesn't give notes like, "This isn't good." They ask questions, they poke, they listen. Why is this moment here? What is the character feeling? What are you trying to say? It's not about fixing a film, it's about helping the filmmaker see it more clearly. And then, the hardest part begins, starting over. Sometimes, that means cutting entire characters, changing endings, rebuilding scenes from nothing. On Up, they rewrote the first half of the film dozens of times. On Brave, the entire creative team shifted. Toy Story 2 was nearly cancelled, then rewritten in just a few months. And Ratatouille was brought to life by a new director halfway through production. Pixar's process is messy, but it works because they trust it. They believe that the first version is never the best one, that the story is something you uncover, not something you impose, and that if you keep asking honest questions, you'll eventually find the answer that feels true. There's a phrase that comes up often in interviews with Pixar's filmmakers: be wrong as fast as you can. It sounds strange, but it means something important. Failure is not the enemy, it's part of the path. And in that, there's something comforting, something worth remembering, not just for filmmaking, but for anything creative. That it's okay to begin badly, to stumble, to not know what you're making until you've already broken it once or twice. Because Pixar doesn't find its stories by getting everything right the first time. It finds them by caring enough to get them right eventually. It's easy now to think of Pixar as a giant, a studio that redefined animation, that turned toys and fish and feelings into box office gold, that won Oscars, reshaped the industry, and became part of the Disney machine. But Pixar didn't start as a giant, and its legacy isn't built on scale, it's built on small things. A lamp hopping into frame, a cowboy scared of being replaced, a robot planting a seed, a dumpling learning how to let go. These are not stories about power or spectacle. They're about fear, longing, family, growing up, letting go. Stories that, even decades later, still feel personal. And part of Pixar's quiet legacy is how it changed what we expect from animated films, not just in how they look, but in what they're allowed to feel like. Pixar never treated children as a limited audience. They didn't simplify emotions or flatten stories. They trusted that a young viewer could understand grief or loneliness or joy, even if they didn't have all the words for it yet. And along the way, they taught adults that it was okay to cry in a movie theater. It wasn't about being sad, it was about being seen. And Pixar did that again and again, without shouting, without rushing, just by returning, film after film, to one simple question: what's the emotional truth underneath all this? Now, the studio is evolving. Some of the original creators have stepped away. New directors are stepping in. The stories are shifting. More voices, more perspectives, more risks. And yet, something familiar remains. Because Pixar's legacy isn't just about its past, it's about the quiet promise it keeps making, that even in a world of noise, a well-told story still matters, that even in a world built on code and rendering engines and billion-dollar franchises, it's still possible to sit down, watch something simple, and feel something honest. The magic of Pixar isn't the animation. It never was. It's the way they remind us, again and again, that even the most ordinary things can be filled with wonder: a lamp, a balloon, a memory, a goodbye. And sometimes, all it takes is a soft story told in the dark to remind you that you're not alone. Thank you for spending your night with Lost at 3 a.m. Sleep well, and good night.